The Subcommittee on Energy and Environment will come to order. Good afternoon. I want to thank the witnesses and the folks in the audience for your patience. We just finished a round of voting, but the good news is we won't have another round till well after this hearing's over. I'm going to start with my opening statement. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today to testify on the scientific and technical issues associated with the Environmental Protection Agency's decision to grant a partial waiver for the use of fuel blends containing up to 15% ethanol, known as E15. At the outset, I'd like to make clear that this hearing is not about picking winners and losers among fuels, or whether ethanol production is inherently good or bad. This hearing will focus specifically on the question, did the EPA use the best available science when granting a partial waiver for the use of E15, and if not, what issues remain unanswered, and what are the potential impacts on the hundreds of millions of engines that will consume E15 fuel in the very near future. Due to this technical focus, we've invited witnesses that will be directly impacted by this decision to testify on the scientific and data quality issues related to mid-level ethanol blends. While the details associated with the EPA E15 decisions are complex and esoteric, their impacts are potentially massive. The properties of ethanol are very different from gasoline, and they may result in problems associated with corrosion, engine failure, increased emissions, materials incompatibility, infrastructure, warranty coverage, and the potential for misfueling. Every American that uses a car, boat, motorcycle, tractor, lawnmower, or any other gasoline-powered equipment could be negatively affected. As we'll hear today, a diverse coalition of interest groups have highlighted the need for greater scientific certainty and more testing for E15. And thanks to the effort of Vice Chairman Sensenbrenner, we now have most automakers on record asserting that EPA testing failed to determine that E15 won't be harmful to car engines and that warranties may not cover any resulting damages. Why then did EPA issue enormously impactful rulings largely on the basis of a single test program conducted by the Department of Energy? We're here today to answer this question, but based on available information, it appears safe to say it was not a science-driven decision that comprehensively addresses the technical concerns identified by stakeholders. Meanwhile, the EPA job-killing machine marches on, driven by a regulated-all-cost mentality and unencumbered by facts. From ethanol to climate regulations to agricultural policies, the experience in my district illustrates how EPA is strangling the economy, and more often than not is doing so on the basis of weak science. Last month, a nearly 100-year-old poultry company, Allen Family Foods, filed for bankruptcy. This company is a major employer on the eastern shore of Maryland. It's the second largest employer in Talbot County, with more than 400 employees at one of its single plants in Cordova, Maryland. The combination of skyrocketing feed prices driven by our ethanol policy and job-killing regulations by EPA has now forced this 100-year-old company to shutter its doors. Last, I want to emphasize that E15 is not a partisan issue. In February, the House voted overwhelmingly in favor of an amendment that would have defunded EPA's implementation of the E15 waiver decision for this fiscal year. Although that language did not become law, the issue clearly remains unresolved. I believe this subcommittee can play an important role in advancing this debate, consistent with past efforts to examine the scientific and technical underpinnings of fuel formulations and vehicle and biofuels technologies more generally. To that end, we have asked witnesses to comment on very brief legislative language that would direct the EPA to contract with the National Academy of Sciences for an independent assessment of the state of the science regarding E15. I look forward to receiving feedback on this preliminary language, and I want to thank the witnesses again for appearing before us today. The Chair now recognizes Ranking Member Miller for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Harris, for the opportunity to hear about current policies regarding renewable fuels and E15. Renewable fuel from biomass, specifically corn-based ethanol, is a complex and controversial issue. And as the panel before us demonstrates, there are many different interests and opinions regarding the ethanol content of our nation's fuel supply. I understand this hearing was supposed to examine the science and testing EPA used in its decision to allow the introduction of E15 to the market. And we may not all agree with EPA's decision or about their decision, but we should be interested in learning more about the underlying science as well as the positive and negative effects that this decision may have. Unfortunately, given the lopsided panel and the sprawling focus of this hearing, I am concerned that we will leave here only slightly more informed about the science around E15 and no closer to agreement on what steps, if any, Congress should take. I agree with Chairman Harris's statement of a moment ago that the EPA should not proceed unencumbered by facts, neither should this subcommittee. Just as we demand that the executive branch work in an efficient, transparent manner, we should also have a clear picture of what we're trying to accomplish within our committee. Since being notified about this hearing and up until the end of last week, and again, Monday was a holiday, we have seen everything from the purpose and scope of the hearing to the selection of witnesses broaden and change. And as a result, I anticipate critical gaps in this committee's record. Much of the science EPA used in making its waiver decision was conducted by the Department of Energy. In fact, DOE's role is the only piece of this issue that is firmly within this committee's jurisdiction. But the majority did not invite DOE to the subcommittee to testify today. It does not inform our understanding of the science if we do not have DOE here to discuss the extensive testing that they conducted. It also violates pretty basic ideas of fairness. That we will have witnesses criticize DOE, and DOE is not here to tell their side of the story. Just last Thursday, the witnesses, along with the minority, received draft legislation on which we were instructed to testify. They were instructed to testify. While the draft is neither particularly complex nor ambitious, that's hardly time for the witnesses to review the material in advance, to submit their testimony, especially, again, given the holiday Monday. Within the last few weeks, Vice Chairman of the full committee, writing on committee stationery, Mr. Sensenbrenner sent letters to the automotive and small engine industry from the committee on the issue of E15. The minority received the response to those letters just 2 days ago. And on Tuesday of this week, day before yesterday, Mr. Sensenbrenner sent a letter to the EPA asking several questions about E15 and setting a deadline of July 22nd for the EPA to respond. If our task is to conduct oversight, thorough oversight, we should have waited to hear back from the EPA before holding this hearing, and certainly not before we ask witnesses and members to review the legislation. It appears that the majority has already drawn its conclusions on the subject without considering EPA's responses or the DOE's explanation of the research, and this hearing is a formality. To build a legislative record on a bill that may or may not be, probably is not, in fact, within our jurisdiction. Mr. Chairman, the EPA should not go off half-cocked. We agree on that. They should not act on incomplete information without considering the views of the people who were most affected by their actions. Neither should this subcommittee. Clean and sustainable renewable fuels are already a part of our economy, and we need to work together towards realizing the future of producing homegrown renewable fuels. In this grand challenge, it is this committee's task to focus on the science and technology. That is why I've invited Mr. Burke from North Carolina to testify today. He will provide a different perspective from the rest of the panel on renewable fuels and discuss how science and technology will help our country get on the road to a sustainable energy future. And with that, I look forward to all of our witnesses' testimony and what I hope will be an honest discussion about the scientific and technological implications of our continued migration from oil to alternative fuels. Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Miller. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. At this time, I'd like to introduce our witness panel. Ms. Margo Oge is the Director of the Office of Transportation and Air Quality at the Environmental Protection Agency, where she's worked since 1980. Mr. Bob Greco is the Group Director for Downstream and Industry Operations at the American Petroleum Institute. Prior to his 21-year career at API, Mr. Greco was an environmental engineer with EPA. Ms. Heather White is the Chief of Staff and General Counsel at the Environmental Working Group. She's previously served as Director of Education Advocacy at the National Wildlife Federation and as counsel to U.S. Senator Russ Feingold on energy and environmental issues. Mr. Jeff Wasil is Emissions Certification Engineer for BRP Evinrude Marine Engine Division. He's here today to testify on behalf of the National Marine Manufacturers Association. Mr. Mike Brown is the President of the National Chicken Council, a trade association representing over 95% of the chickens produced in the United States. Mr. Brown was previously Senior Vice President at the American Meat Institute. Ranking Member Miller has asked for the opportunity to introduce our next witness, Mr. Stephen Burke. I now recognize Mr. Miller for up to 2 minutes for his introduction.
Thank you. Mr. Burke became the president and CEO of the Biofuels Center of North Carolina in March of 2009. He served as founding board chair from July of 2007 until that date, and as acting president since August 2008. The Biofuels Center is a private nonprofit corporation established by the state of North Carolina to craft and implement a policy commitment for a sustained statewide biofuels initiative. Mr. Burke departed the North Carolina Biotechnology Center in 2009 as Senior Vice President for Corporate Affairs, and for more than 24 years he helped shape the approach and strategies of the Biotechnology Center, the world's first targeted initiative for biotechnology development. Before joining the Biotechnology Center in 1985, as its fifth employee, he taught instructional design at North Carolina State University in Raleigh. I'm very happy to have Mr. Burke here from North Carolina. We have met a number of times, and I believe his perspective will add to the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Our final witness is Dr. Ron Sahu, an independent technical consultant who's provided consulting services to the EPA and others on a variety of environmental matters. He's here today on behalf of the Outdoor Power Equipment Institute, a trade association whose members make a wide range of outdoor power equipment, including lawn and garden equipment. Dr. Sahu holds a master's and a PhD in mechanical engineering from the California Institute of Technology. And I want to thank you all for appearing before the subcommittee today. As our witnesses should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes each, after which the members of the committee will have 5 minutes each to ask questions. I now recognize our first witness, Margo Oge from the Environmental Protection Agency.
Mr. Chairman, member of the subcommittee, I really appreciate the opportunity to testify on EPA's response to a request by ethanol producers to allow higher levels of ethanol in gasoline for use in conventional vehicles. Ethanol producers filed a request in March of 2009 that EPA increase the permissible concentration of ethanol in gasoline to 15%, which EPA granted in part and denied in part. An EPA decision to grant a waiver by no means requires that E15 must be used or sold in the marketplace. Now, in researching this decision, EPA considered all the available evidence, including extensive test data developed by the Department of Transportation and other researchers. In fact, we believe that the waiver record is extensive and strong. It includes DOE's Department of Energy's testing of 19 vehicle models to provide statistically sound conclusions about model year 2007 and newer vehicles and their ability to meet exhaust emission standards. It also includes the Department of Energy study for model year 2001, 2006 vehicles that tested models that were selected because of their sensitivity to ethanol, high ethanol levels. Now, those studies, along with other information, several CRC reports, EPA compliance data, manufacturer certification data, in-use testing, and manufacturers' defect reports provided the relevant information for the administrator to make a decision about the potential impacts of E15, not just for the exhaust emissions, but also for evaporative emissions, material compatibility, and drivability. We did not wait for the results of several ongoing studies because the record in front of us was sufficient without those studies. And I must tell you that many of the studies that are still being done, they're not designed to answer the specific question before EPA. Would E15 cause or contribute to failure of emission standards when the vehicles and engines were designed? In sum, the extensive testing data and other information before EPA, we believe provides a strong technical basis for the administrator's decision to allow E15 to be sold for model year 2001 and newer light-duty vehicles. We also found that E15 did not meet the Clean Air Act requirement in the case of older vehicles, older than 2001, and off-road gasoline power equipment. Now, in making the waiver decision, EPA also fully complied with applicable legal requirements under the Clean Air Act for public notice and comment. Section 211F of the Clean Air Act specifically requires that we provide public notice and an opportunity to comment on E15 waiver applications. The agency believes that we have met that requirement. To reduce the potential for misfueling with E15, we have established several measures that draw on our experience, many years of experience with fuel transitions. In the waiver decision, EPA required fuel producers that decide to introduce E15 in the marketplace to develop and implement a misfueling plan, includes labeling of E15 pumps. Let me make it clear that a number of additional steps are needed before E15 can enter the marketplace. Many are not under EPA's control. We have yet not received a complete application by the renewable fuel producers that is required under the Clean Air Act to register E15, and only when the E15 is registered it can be introduced into the commerce. In addition, retail stations that want to sell E15 will need to consider the compatibility of their underground storage tanks based on recent issue EPA guidance. Stations that want to sell E15 will need to consider whether changes are needed to fuel dispensing equipment. And many states, as you may know, rely on ASTM procedures before new fuels are introduced in the marketplace. As E15 enters the marketplace, EPA is committed to work with all stakeholders to monitor the development and help address any potential issues that may arise. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I look forward to answer any of your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Greco?
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee. My name is Bob Greco, and I am Downstream Group Director for the American Petroleum Institute, API. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on EPA's premature decision to grant a partial waiver allowing ethanol blends of up to 15% in gasoline, otherwise known as E15. API represents over 470 member companies involved in all aspects of the oil and natural gas industry. API members provide the fuels that keep America running. API supports the continued appropriate use of ethanol to help meet our nation's energy demand. With the Renewable Fuel Standard, or RFS2, biofuels are an increasingly significant part of the transportation fuel mix. However, E15 is a new transportation fuel. It contains 50% more oxygen, well outside the range for which U.S. vehicles and engines have been designed and warranted. It is thus critically important to evaluate the short and long-term impacts of this new fuel on the environment and on engine and vehicle performance and safety. Shortly after the enactment of the Energy Independence and Security Act in 2007, the oil and auto industries and other stakeholders, including EPA and DOE, recognized that substantial research was needed to assess the compatibility of higher ethanol blends with existing vehicles and small engines. Through the Coordinating Research Council, or CRC, the oil and auto industries developed and funded a comprehensive multi-year test program, which was actually initiated prior to the E15 waiver application. My written testimony includes additional background on the CRC. The oil and auto industries have contributed close to $14 million towards mid-level ethanol blends research over the past several years. Attachment 1 of my written testimony lists the CRC research programs and our schedule for completion. This research examines the following areas: the durability of the engine itself, particularly the engine valves and valve seats, the durability of the fuel storage and handling equipment, the computerized onboard diagnostic system, or OBD, which the driver often sees as a check engine light, and the vehicle evaporative emissions control system, which minimizes the release of fuel vapors to the atmosphere. I disagree with Margo about whether these are emissions related or not. We can talk about that during the comment period. Most of this work will be completed by year's end. However, the preliminary test results in which, in at least 2 program areas, engine durability and fuel system durability, suggest that further investigation is warranted. We shared this schedule and preliminary test results with EPA on several occasions, but the agency ignored this research. Instead of waiting for the CRC studies to be completed and thoroughly evaluated, EPA improperly used the data from a DOE catalyst durability program and drew conclusions about E15 effects for which this DOE program was not designed to evaluate. In addition, research is being conducted on E15's compatibility with gas station pumps, hoses, nozzles, gaskets, and underground storage equipment. This work is in partnership with EPA and 2 DOE national labs, Oak Ridge National Lab and the National Renewable Energy Lab, or NREL. NREL's research indicates that 70% of the used equipment tested and 40% of the new equipment tested yielded either non-compliant or inconclusive test results. These are potentially serious safety concerns for consumers and gas station attendants from dispensing E15 from any equipment that is not specifically listed for its use. EPA recently released their gasoline pump labeling rule, and API has serious concerns with their approach. The rule weakened the final label design from what they originally proposed. In conclusion, EPA's desire to allow more ethanol in fuels cannot be allowed to harm our customers' investments in safe, reliable, and economical transportation. If consumer satisfaction and safety are compromised, the credibility of not only future biofuels, but the entire RFS2 program will be questioned and challenged. That is why the oil and auto industries are supporting a comprehensive test program through the CRC, and testing has revealed reasons for concern. The E15 waiver controversy, however, points to the larger problem with the RFS2 mandates. The amount of biofuels required is fast approaching the limit of the vehicle fleet to safely utilize them. Within the next year or so, this blend wall will likely be exceeded, and refiners are greatly concerned about complying with an unworkable mandate. API urges Congress to seriously examine this looming issue and realign the biofuels mandates to fit the capabilities of the vehicle fleet. A premature E15 waiver is not the solution. Thank you for your time today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Greco. Ms. White?
Chairman Harris, Ranking Member Miller, and members of the subcommittee, my name is Heather White. I am Chief of Staff and General Counsel to Environmental Working Group, a nonprofit research and advocacy organization based here in Washington with offices in Iowa and California. Thank you for the opportunity to testify at this important hearing. Mr. Chairman, today the corn ethanol industry enjoys the luxury of a lucrative market created almost entirely by government intervention at taxpayer expense. Corn producers and ethanol companies press in tandem for any government intervention, especially from Washington, that will, by expanding the market for corn ethanol, automatically expand the market to deal with our oversupply of corn. An oversupply that was created in part by USDA crop subsidies, price and income supports. That's what this E15 debate is about, not energy policy or energy independence. We believe the government should play a strong leadership and regulatory role in shaping the nation's energy future. But making additional market-distorting commitments to corn ethanol is not the way to get there. Adding small, well-tested amounts of ethanol as an engine fuel additive to reduce air pollution in targeted areas makes sense. But corn ethanol is not an alternative transportation fuel. Mandating higher blends will increase air pollution. Corn requires more pesticides and fertilizers than other crops. Sky-high corn prices have already resulted in fence-row to fence-row planting. That depletes the soil, pollutes water, causes drastic soil losses. On top of that, imagine the consumer nightmare of E15 when people use the wrong gas, damage their car or truck, lawnmowers or boats, and realize their warranties are no good. Our comprehensive review of the current science concludes that the data do not support a decision to waive the Clean Air Act for E15. Higher ethanol blends lead to more toxic air pollution, lower gas mileage, more leaks from underground storage tanks, greater potential for drinking water contamination, and damage to older cars and trucks and small engines. We believe in a strong, vibrant, well-funded EPA and robust authority for the administrator. And the majority of the time, we're on EPA's side. This agency protects our public health and has saved billions of dollars in healthcare costs through environmental enforcement and regulation. But we think this decision is a bad call. It asks Americans to play roulette at the gas station if they fill an unapproved vehicle with E15. Earlier this year, we asked 13 car makers whether vehicles made after 2001 could use E15 and whether the warranty would cover engine damage related to E15. The answer for most companies was either no, the warranty won't cover you, or we don't know. Congressman Sensenbrenner received similar responses recently when he did his own survey of automakers. Crowning corn ethanol the energy winner is unfair to real clean energy technologies. In addition to corn subsidies, the industry benefits from the ethanol blenders tax credit, an import tariff, and mandated production under the renewable fuel standard. These subsidies are crowding out the market for more promising advanced biofuels. Remember in 2007 when Congress was told that the renewable fuel standard would set up a corn ethanol as the bridge to better advanced biofuels. Corn ethanol has since exceeded its mandate, but EPA has lowered advanced biofuel production targets by 90%. In fact, corn ethanol is a bridge to nowhere. The industry's response to its broken promises is to ask for even more government handouts. In the face of an overwhelming Senate vote to end the blender's tax credit, its latest ploy is to get taxpayers to pay for special gasoline blender pumps that can handle various ethanol blends. But wasting more money on corn ethanol will only lock in this environmentally unsustainable fuel while locking out alternatives, among them drop-in fuels, such as those made from switchgrass, wood, crop residues, and algae that do not require special pumps. In conclusion, EWG supports 1. Efforts to reduce overall gasoline consumption through fuel efficiency and mass transit. 2. Biofuels, especially drop-in fuels that use existing infrastructure, conserve soil, water, air, and wildlife habitat, do not compete with the food supply, and do not divert farmland from food production. And finally, the committee's draft language calling for a National Academy of Sciences study on mid-level ethanol blends. We need greater scientific certainty before we move forward and introduce this fuel into our nation's fuel supply. Thank you. I welcome the opportunity to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. White. Mr. Wasil.
Good afternoon, Chairman Harris, Ranking Member Miller, and other members of the subcommittee. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. My name is Jeff Wasil, and I am the Emissions Certification Engineer for BRP Marine Engine Division located in Sturtevant, Wisconsin. I'm here today to testify on behalf of the National Marine Manufacturers Association, which represents over 1,500 boat builders, marine engine, and marine accessory manufacturers. I am responsible for marine engine emissions certification testing, ensuring that all of our marine engines are compliant with the U.S. EPA, California Air Resources Board, and other global marine regulatory regulations. Additionally, I ensure that the engines that we sell will remain durable and perform to customers' expectations. Over the past 12 years, I have published several peer-reviewed technical papers on marine engine emissions, including particulate matter, gaseous emissions, and alternative fuels. This experience and other marine testing that I've done makes me uniquely qualified to tell you why I think it is a bad idea for the U.S. EPA to allow an increase in the volume of ethanol in gasoline, and why I believe EPA has not followed proper procedures in either its decision to propose an ethanol increase in our gasoline supply or in their proposed warnings to consumers about the problems they know would be caused by E15 gasoline. I'm here today representing NMMA and my company, but in a larger sense, I am representing many different kinds of engine manufacturers, including marine, lawnmower, chainsaw, snowblower, and snowmobile. These types of engines that EPA refers to as non-road engines typically do not have combustion feedback sensors capable of adjusting the air-fuel ratio of the engine to meet the specific requirements of the fuel. Ethanol is not gasoline, and the problem is that ethanol is a partially oxidized fuel having a lower energy content than gasoline. As higher quantities of ethanol are blended into base gasoline, oxygen contained in the fuel increases, for which the engine cannot compensate. Since many non-road engines do not have the capability of detecting the air-fuel ratio requirements of the fuel, the engine could face catastrophic failure. As the person responsible for emission certifications, EPA requires me to design, certify, and lock in with tamper-proof controls the optimum air-fuel ratio needed to meet emission requirements. When the fuel changes in the marketplace and additional oxygenates are added, such as going from E10 to E15 gasoline, engines run hotter, causing serious durability issues and increased emissions, either in the form of increased nitrogen oxides or increased hydrocarbons due to misfire. Last week, EPA finalized a label that would be required on fuel pumps at gas stations, warning consumers that using E15 in certain types of engines may damage them. NMMA believes that the language in the label is severely inadequate and will do little to properly inform and educate consumers as to the serious consequences of using the wrong fuel. Although NMMA and others petitioned EPA to require gas stations that offer E15 to also offer E10, EPA has denied this petition and has no plans to mandate the continued availability of E10. This will certainly lead to the very misfueling that EPA wants to avoid. Growth Energy and other ethanol proponents will say that if there is a demand for E10, the marketplace will ensure that some stations will carry it. And this may very well be true to a certain extent. However, it's very unlikely that every gas station would carry E10, which would certainly increase the likelihood of misfueling. Now, I have seen some of the preliminary results of testing that has been conducted on marine engines by the Department of Energy. These results have not yet been made public, and we have been asked by DOE not to say anything specific until the report is final. But I can say that in these tests, the majority of engines that were run on E15 suffered significant damage or exhibited poor engine runnability, performance, and difficult starting, none of which is acceptable when on a boat out at sea. I'd like to end my testimony today on a positive note and mention an alternative fuel that is currently being evaluated. Last year, I published a technical paper on the effects of butanol extended fuels in marine outboard engines. Butanol has an energy content closer to that of gasoline and is not hygroscopic, meaning that it is unlikely to absorb water and phase separate like ethanol. Based on this preliminary study, the data is promising in terms of better compatibility with existing engines and fuel systems. Additionally, NMMA and others are also currently evaluating the use of butanol extended fuels in marine products. Butanol certainly does have potential and may allow for continued use of biofuel with better compatibility with existing engines and fuel system components. And finally, more testing should be done to determine the effects of E15 on various kinds of engines and to see whether there might be alternatives to ethanol, such as butanol. Additionally, the committee asked me to comment on the legislation it is considering to engage the National Academy of Sciences to conduct a study of all scientific data on ethanol blends and their effects on engines. I do believe that this legislation is a good idea. Thank you very much for allowing me to testify today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wasil. Mr. Brown.
Good afternoon, Chairman Harris, Congressman Miller, and members of the committee. Thank you, Chairman Harris, for the opportunity to participate in today's hearing. Also, while unfortunate, I know I appreciate, as does Chick Allen, his family, his growers and employees, your comments regarding their plight. I know the remaining companies on the Eastern Shore appreciate your efforts, as they do Mr. Bartlett's efforts this morning before the Small Business Committee on the Livestock Rules. So thank you. I am Mike Brown, President of the National Chicken Council. Companies accounting for more than 95% of the chicken produced and processed in the United States are members of the National Chicken Council. NCC is extremely disappointed and dismayed that the Environmental Protection Agency issued a final approval on June 28, 2011 for new labeling for the sale of gasoline blended with 15% ethanol. The E15 gasoline blend is 50% greater than the E10 currently sold at most gasoline pumps. Putting aside the definite and common sense problem of misfueling this action will cause, NCC cannot understand why the federal government is taking this untimely and unfortunate step to put more pressure on an already precarious corn crop this fall. A misguided ethanol policy is being further misguided by the rush to placate the corn ethanol interest. NCC appreciates the 73 senators who voted last month to begin to stop the madness of full speed ahead for ethanol, regardless of the cost or economic fallout on the U.S. economy. The senators recognize that repealing the VTEC and eliminating the import tariff on foreign ethanol would not just save taxpayers billions of dollars, but would also send a message that ethanol manufacturers need to learn to operate in a free market economy, not a cocoon of government subsidies, mandated usage, and insulation from market competition. NCC urges the House to follow suit. In addition, NCC very much appreciates the 283 House members who last month voted to approve an amendment that would prohibit USDA from allocating funds for ethanol infrastructure, including blender pumps in storage facilities. NCC questions the so-called compromise efforts being debated in Congress to allow the ethanol industry to have its corn and eat it too. Compromise in NCC's dictionary means that the ethanol industry needs to allow for a good measure of flexibility in the ethanol policy and program going forward. Moving from a tax credit for blenders to a subsidy to build infrastructure is simply dressing up ethanol policy in another dress and is not a compromise. More specifically, the RFS needs to be subject to an adjustment when market forces in the corn harvest are such that market needs cannot be met at a reasonable cost to users. This is one reason why NCC supports legislation to permit individual states to opt out of corn ethanol portion of the RFS. The policies and rules of the game for corn-based ethanol must be rebalanced and the playing field must be leveled to permit chicken producers and other animal agriculture producers to more fairly compete for very limited supplies of corn this year and most likely for the next few years. Our companies compete every day in the marketplace domestically and internationally. We cannot compete with the United States government. Broiler companies, since last October, when the sudden unexpected run-up in corn and other feed ingredients occurred, have tried to weather the storm of very high, volatile corn prices. But now, companies are trimming their production plans, which means growers will receive fewer chicks to grow to market, and processing plant shifts will be reduced, further affecting employment. A broiler company in Georgia just announced last week 300 workers will no longer be needed. Also this month, the fourth-generation broiler company in Delaware filed for bankruptcy protection while it works to secure an owner for its assets. Further, a company in Arkansas last week announced plans to consolidate 2 processing plants as well as 2 hatcheries. This consolidation will result in additional 223 jobs being eliminated. The company in its announcement indicated that eliminating these jobs will give it a better chance to survive. I would like to tell this committee that this downsizing is the end of the broiler industry's financial problems, but I cannot tell you that because there are a number of other companies on the financial bubble. Banks and other lending institutions are telling these companies enough is enough, meaning sell your assets and repay your outstanding debt. What some analysts say about the broiler industry of 10 companies in 10 years may become a reality much, much sooner. NCC strongly supports legislation that the subcommittee asked for our views on that would require the administrator of the EPA to contract with the National Academy of Sciences to conduct a comprehensive assessment on the ramifications of the use of ethanol blends. Chicken companies and all of animal agriculture are bearing the burden and feeling the disastrous effects of competing for corn on a field that is heavily tilted towards the ethanol industry. Mr. Chairman, I've submitted more in-depth testimony, and I'll conclude my remarks here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brown. Mr. Burke.
Mr. Harris, Mr. Miller, members, the Biofuel Center of North Carolina was established by our legislature in 2007 to implement a long-term state policy goal to gain large internal capacity for alternatives to petroleum-based liquid fuels. I've been asked today to explicate our thinking, not to provide technical E15 responses. I offer, however, a simple statement about the E15 decision. Assuming technical concerns can be addressed, the Biofuel Center supports it as a necessary intermediate step on the road to this nation's larger goals for advanced biofuels. More time is needed for their development. In the interim, increased ethanol use, ethanol not necessarily in time made from corn, catalyzes new technology, affirms economic and environmental benefits, and prepares us for the next large amounts of generational feedstocks and facilities. Biofuels development in North Carolina is shaped by a realistic premise. America will continue to seek more augmentation of petroleum-based liquid fuels, and thus needs new state models to gain large amounts of liquid fuel from sources other than corn and places other than our Midwestern states. North Carolina's model springs from a bold goal. By 2017, we seek to gain 10% of our state's liquid transportation fuels from biofuels grown and produced in North Carolina. 600 million gallons are estimated to be required. Appropriation and policy support for this goal is sustained and nonpartisan. Biofuels is judged a matter of shared future thinking policy. How does a state create the disciplined framework required for a complicated long-term new sector? The question is important, for states should assume increasing leadership in bringing biofuels to our national landscape. North Carolina's nationally unique biofuels endeavor is shaped by 6 imperatives. Imperative 1, by policy, the biofuels endeavor is not based on corn-derived ethanol. Judged unusual when laid out in 2007, the decision has proven smart. North Carolina does not efficiently produce corn, and our large animal sectors must not be disadvantaged. As such, other crop and tree-based feedstocks must be developed. Energy, grasses, and wood will likely be dominant. Imperative 2, biofuels must be seen and shaped as a technology. Despite large production of ethanol in the Midwest and in Brazil, the technology is nascent and unfolding. At an early stage comparable to mainframe computers, current corn-based ethanol production displays the historical reality of technologies. They begin with what we know and with what we can do, and then evolve. Such evolution will yield new ways to make fuels from new sources in more places. Imperative 3, a comprehensive approach is required, for piecemeal attention yields uncertain success in technology development. A dovetailed approach addresses every aspect of biofuels: science, growing, pilot and large-scale production, company development, distribution, training, land, biomass financing, environmental policy issues, public preparation. Imperative 4, the endeavor for biofuels is civic in scale and responsibility, as biofuels affects the largest components of our society: science, technology, agriculture, crops, forests, policy, strategy, public choices, cars, car culture, land, energy, economic gain, production, distribution, environment, sustainability, jobs, daily life, and in fact, every one of us. Civic is at hand. Imperative 5, economic and agricultural sustainability of crop and tree-based resources over time must be ensured. For national feedstock requirements will be enormous and unprecedented. Imperative 6, innovative targeted projects are required. 3 representative examples are underway in North Carolina's biofuels endeavor. 1, North Carolina's Biofuels Campus. A 426-acre campus will be developed over the next 10 years as the nation's only large site for growing, company development, public engagement, and demonstration. 2, use of swine lagoon spray fields. North Carolina's swine industry yields lagoon effluents sprayed for remediation on 100,000 acres growing low-value coastal Bermuda grass. The Biofuels Center has trials underway to verify environmental and economic benefits to instead grow cellulosic energy grasses: sorghum, switchgrass, miscanthus, and arundo donax. Project Eastern Gain. We seek by 2016 to gain 50 million gallons of jet aviation fuel from our land contiguous to bases. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Burke. I now recognize our final witness, Dr. Ron Sahu, testifying on behalf of the Outdoor Power Equipment Institute.
Good afternoon, Chairman Harris, Ranking Member Miller, and other members of the committee.
Okay. I think you have to turn your microphone on because we're being recorded.
I'll use this one instead. Thank you. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear. I am an independent technical consultant. As the chair noted in the introduction, I have a bachelor's and master's and PhD in mechanical engineering, the latter two from Caltech. Since about 2005, I have been looking at the impact of what is commonly called mid-level ethanol blends in the fuel mix on a variety of equipment. It began with the effort in Minnesota, and ever since that time, and in the years pursuant, I have done extensive research on almost every aspect of the fuel impact on equipment. I'm not going to repeat much of what I heard from my other panelists in the interest of time, and going last, I have that advantage, so I'm going to hit some of the points that were not made or could not be made because of time. Let me give you a scale of this potential problem. I understand EPA's waiver decision is limited to automobiles and late model automobiles. Even assuming that those automobiles are perfectly capable of handling E15, that still leaves us with a potential problem. And there may be reason to believe that that universe is still likely to be impacted negatively. There are collectively around 500 million pieces of equipment in this country, legacy equipment, that are already out there. Everything from boats and cars, including outdoor equipment. Much of that equipment is incapable of adaptive technology to handle new fuels, so it is out there. Much of it cannot be tracked. We estimate a replacement value north of $2 trillion for that universe. This group is going to be drinking gasoline, so to speak, from the same pool that the automobiles drink. So there is no way to separate the fuel pool unless designed by regulation. Although there are so many pieces of equipment, as a percent user of gasoline, the non-road sector is a relatively small percentage. So there is little incentive for dispensers to create separate infrastructure to support this large but small volume user group. But let us not confuse that with risk and harm. The harm and risk is not proportional to the volume of the market. This is a technical hearing. Let me point to some critical things we've learned, I think universally from the Department of Energy Studies, State of Minnesota work, independent work that industry has done. Ethanol increase to E15 will cause increased temperatures, exhaust temperatures, and equipment temperatures. A lot of equipment is used very close to the operators. If you've seen people operating a chainsaw or a blower, it is next to their person. The inability to handle higher amounts of heat properly without sustaining burns is a critical safety issue. Increased temperatures will also affect material usage and deterioration, including rubbers, elastomers, plastics, variety of metals that are used in the equipment that is already out there. Increased permeation and other evaporative emissions will also result. And another safety issue is inadvertent misoperation of equipment. Take chainsaw, for example. If a chainsaw starts to engage, the clutch engages at a different rotational speed before the operator expects it to, you can only imagine the catastrophic consequences. And that is one of the findings of the DOE study, is unintentional clutch engagement of that type of close-in, hard-bladed equipment. We appreciate the dilemma that EPA had in making its regulatory decision. We certainly do. But in spite of asking for a sound and tough label that would provide some measure of separation in this common pool, EPA declined to provide a strong label. We do not think the label proposed is at all going to serve the need to segregate or warn people. In fact, it's an attention label, not even a warning label. And as a fellow panelist noted, EPA has declined to mandate the availability of E10 for this large universe, which means misfueling is a strong possibility. I would urge the committee in its National Academy of Science study to expand the scope specifically with regards to two items. One, to expand the work that they need to do to look at implications of compatibility issues, higher temperatures, and safety. The second is they should critically examine the issue of misfueling, because misfueling is a very complex issue, and they should go beyond labels and look at all the other ways in which a more sound barrier can be provided between a waiver that applies to a portion of the population and not to the others. I'll be happy to answer any questions that the committee may have later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sahu. And I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. And I want to, again, thank you very much to the whole panel for your patience in letting us get a little late start because of the voting. Let me just ask a question. Mr. Greco, did you mention valves and valve seats in your testimony and the possible effect on that?
That's correct. That's one of the criteria we're looking at when we say engine durability. We have 5 different categories.
So we don't really know whether E15 would adversely affect the wear of valve and valve seats. And the specific reason I'm asking, I mean, I've replaced valve and valve seats. I mean, if your valve seat fails prematurely, you lack compression, you will get whatever you're putting in that cylinder into the ambient air. I mean, it's not an emission control system specifically defined as such in a car manufacturer's manual, but it certainly functions as that because it seals off the combustion chamber from the ambient environment. Is that
That's
correct?
Yes, you shouldn't have to. The engine now has to handle that increased leakage as a result, potentially of ethanol. And we
Right.
have seen some failures. Again, it's preliminary information, but that does seem to be one of the impacts that we've seen on some engines.
So if the EPA only studied, or the DOE in their study didn't take into account premature valve wear, they could come up with the conclusion that, well, it doesn't affect any of the emission systems, but it, in fact, could have an adverse effect on emissions from that car.
That's correct. EPA took a very
That's what I
narrow
thought.
definition.
Okay, Ms. Oge, let me ask you a question. Did the EPA take into consideration the effect on emissions, take into account that, in fact, from what Vice Chairman Sensenbrenner's letters from the auto companies would indicate, that we may be invalidated, the use of E15 in a car might invalidate the warranty on emission systems in the car?
Sir, what I'm going to let you know is that, can I answer something?
No, I only
Okay,
have 5 minutes.
Okay.
You've got to stay on
yes,
my question.
Yes, we did. And
You
actually,
did.
yes,
So
we did.
is it possible that use of E15 will invalidate the warranty on emissions control systems?
It's not. As long as E15 is used for 2001 in newer vehicles, we strongly believe, and the record was front of the administrator when she signed the waivers, that 2001 in newer vehicles will not be undermined.
You misunderstand my question. If I buy a car and its vehicle emission system for some reason doesn't work right in 4 years, because they have to be warranted for 5 years,
Yes.
my understanding. So at 4 years, it stops working. I take it to the dealer and they say, "Oops, you've used E15. We're not going to repair this under warranty." If I live in a place where they don't test my vehicle emissions, or they don't test me, I just go out and say, well, if you're not paying for it, I'm just driving my car around with the emission system not working. I mean, invalidating a warranty has an effect on emissions, because these systems may not get repaired under warranty. If they don't get repaired under warranty, they may not get repaired at all.
So the warranty...
So did the EPA take that possibility that the warranties may be invalidated?
Again, the decision that we made, if the consumer uses E15 for 2001 in your vehicles, that warranty will not be impacted. So for your example...
Ms. Oge, how can it not be impacted when the dealer...
Let me answer.
Well, again, I only have 2 minutes, so you can't filibuster me on this. When we have letters from companies saying that, specifically from Honda, saying our manual says if you use E15, if you use E10 and below, you're warranted. If you use E15, it will compromise the vehicle's warranty.
Sir, we talked to Honda, we talked to all the companies, we have seen the letters that came back from the car companies. There is not any facts or any hard data to demonstrate, and we have had discussions with the car companies. Please give us one test data that will suggest that if you use E15 for 2001 in your vehicles, that will be impact on the 120,000 miles durability of the emission control systems. There is not a single
And it doesn't make a
test data.
difference whether it affects that system. If that system fails, the auto company, under contract with an individual, the individual knowingly put E15 in there, or because maybe that all is available, the company legitimately can say, we're not covering that system under warranty. You knowingly put a fuel in that your owner's manual said you shouldn't be putting in. I understand that you say you think it won't adversely affect the system, but the auto company doesn't care. If that system fails for another reason, a piece of plastic broke in the EGR valve, they are not under obligation if you have put the wrong. Is that my reading of
may
warranties?
I answer? No, it's
Sure.
not. The consumer or the gas station will have to demonstrate that indeed it was the fuel that caused the impact on the catalytic converters.
I think you give way too much credit for what gets refused under an automotive warranty. And anybody who's brought a car to a dealer under an automotive warranty, I think, understands what I'm talking about. Anyway, I will recognize Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Oge, I understand that there are different fuels in use now. Obviously, it's a big mistake to put diesel fuel in your car if you don't have a diesel engine. But there are other fuels in effect in widespread use. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay, and some are appropriate for some engines and not for others?
Yes.
And how much of a problem has the EPA discerned that there is with misfueling?
That's a very good question, actually. In 2006, EPA mandated, actually, that diesel fuel contains low sulfur levels from 500 parts per million to 15 parts per million. So we mandated a cleaner diesel fuel because the new diesel truck engines introduced in the marketplace could have impacts of their emission control systems if higher diesel fuel was introduced in the marketplace. So the agency used similar procedures that we're using here for E15, for misfueling labeling, to make sure that there is appropriate product transfer documentation from point A to point Z. So to answer your question, we have had very good experience with the clean diesel fuel in 2006, where actually the consumer, if used the wrong diesel fuel, could have impact, severe impact, to their engines, not just on emission control systems, but also to the engine itself.
Okay. I'm one of those who voted against implementing this rule immediately for the next year, and the reason was concern about emissions. As Ms. White acknowledged in her testimony, the Environmental Working Group usually supports the work of the EPA, but you all have parted company on this issue. And with respect to the effect on E15 on emissions of vehicles 2001 and newer, do the emissions for those vehicles using E15 stay within the EPA minimum emission standards?
Yes, it does. Actually, the data shows that emissions for nitrogen oxides using E15 will increase. Emissions for hydrocarbon, CO, and benzene will decrease. But also under the 2007 Energy Independence and Safety Act, Congress has requested that EPA evaluates these potential increases and takes steps to reduce those increases. And EPA is in the process of doing that with a new program that we are developing under the direction of our president to reduce emissions from both fuel and cars to address this issue.
And your rules allow you to kind of swap off emissions, that if formaldehyde goes above levels but something else goes below, that you can kind of trade it around?
No. Our rules require, the waiver decision is based on demonstrating that the vehicles and engines that E15 is going to be allowed to use, this E15 fuel will not cause or contribute the emissions of those vehicles to fail. So our determination clearly shows that 2001 and newer vehicles will continue to meet those standards. However, overall, there will be some increases, still meeting the standards. There will be some increases on nitrogen oxides. There will be decreases on hydrocarbon and CO and benzene. Congress has directed us to make sure that we net out those increases, but the standards will still be met.
All right. Ms. White, do you wish to be heard on this point?
Yes, I think the point really is looking at the Department of Energy tests that EPA based at least part of its waiver decision on. For model years 2001 to 2007, at least 50% of the cars that they tested failed at least one emission standard. And then when we looked at 2007 or newer cars, at least 20% of the cars tested failed. So, we're obviously concerned about the emissions, whether or not the balancing test under the EPA regulations pans out. The fact that there was a small number of cars sampled and that there were high rates, in our opinion, of failure for really serious emissions that we're talking about, nitrous. When we're talking about formaldehyde, for example, which is a known carcinogen, there really is serious public health implications here. I think one of the questions that we don't know the answer to is where are these older model cars? Where are we going to see impacts in air pollution?
Well, of course, it would be useful to have the Department of Energy here to address this issue. Mr. Chairman, it is peculiar that, hearing about ethanol, we have a witness from the petroleum industry, but not from the ethanol industry. We have, however, received a letter from the Renewable Fuels Association, which is the trade association for the ethanol industry. Without embracing the contents of the letter as my own, I would like to enter this into the record of the hearing out of simple fairness.
Without objection. Now, I do want to, without objection, I want to ask unanimous consent to enter 4 items into the record as well. These items are in the public domain and shared with the minority. Number 1 is EPA's partial grant and partial denial of Clean Air Act waiver applications submitted by Growth Energy to increase the allowable ethanol content of gasoline to 15%. In the light of the Renewable Fuel Association's concern, I note the EPA's decision makes it very clear that the agency did not rely upon the Renewable Fuel Association study. EPA said that RFA's study simply, quote, conducted a literature search of existing information, end quote, already cited and did not, end quote, did not perform any emissions or durability testing. The second item is the subsequent partial grant of Clean Energy Act waiver applications submitted by Growth Energy to increase the allowable ethanol content of gasoline to 15%, decision of the administrator. That's from the Federal Register, January 26, 2011. A letter dated March 26, 2009, sent from over 40 business, environmental, taxpayer, free market, and public health groups to Administrator Jackson and other administration officials asking that any waiver decision on E15 heed President Obama's memorandum on, quote, scientific integrity. And finally, a joint letter from the American Motorcyclists Association and the All-Terrain Vehicle Association dated July 6, 2011, sent to Ranking Member Miller and me in support of the discussion draft language considered at this hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I want to recognize Dr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Ogay, why did the EPA and Department of Energy choose to fund the E15 research to support the waiver petition rather than asking the petitioners themselves to pay for the necessary research? It's my understanding that previously all other petitioners, the EPA's insisted that the petitioner pay. Why did y'all use taxpayers' dollars to do this research?
Sir, I think this question should go to Department of Energy. EPA did not fund the study. We work with them.
Y'all didn't have any decision.
No funding.
Okay.
No funding.
In EPA's decision document for the first E15 waiver, EPA dismissed the CRC engine durability test program, stating that the data provided up to that point in time only pertained to E20, the E20 blends. This ongoing program has recently identified potential engine failures on E15. How will the EPA consider this new information with respect to the waiver?
Sir, the DOE program was designed with participation.
How will y'all consider this, though?
Well,
you have failures.
We believe that the administrator made a decision based on the best record, which was the Department of Energy's statistically significant developed study and other data that EPA has. We test cars. We have thousands of certificates. We are aware of the 4 studies that CRC is doing. Those studies, however, are not designed to answer the question front of the administrator.
Ma'am, I apologize for cutting you off. I just have 3 minutes left. Mr. Greco, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, a couple of things. I think she was about to say that the DOE program was not designed to, or was designed to address these emissions. As I mentioned, EPA did not properly use the DOE research program. It was designed to test catalyst durability, which is one particular set of parameters to stress the catalytic converter. If you want to stress the engine, you're going to design a test program differently. EPA, with DOE, inappropriately utilized a catalyst program to break down the engines and draw conclusions about engine durability. We let EPA know at the time and DOE that was an inappropriate way to go forward, that we had designed a more thorough and more robust program, but they decided not to go that route.
So they didn't use good scientific integrity in that, obviously. Speaking of scientific integrity, in March of 2009, Lisa Jackson was sent a letter from a diverse coalition of more than 40 businesses, environmental, taxpayer, free market, and public health groups that called on the EPA to heed President Obama's memorandum on scientific integrity. A key tenet of these principles is that agencies should not dismiss scientific information associated with public policy decisions. If oxygen sensors are found to fail because of E15 exposure, will EPA rescind its waiver determination?
Sir, we're on litigation. I would not answer this. The only thing I have to tell you is that the CRC studies that you're referring are not designed appropriately. the way that the DOE extensive, sound, robust study was designed. Therefore, the results, if they show failures, are not going to be viewed in the same light as a well-designed, scientifically robust study as the Department of Energy study.
Well, in June of 2008, EPA staff gave a presentation that outlined what it would take to grant a waiver for mid-level ethanol blends. In that were recommendations that included the need of testing of all types of emissions, and that tests should be completed on medium-duty vehicles, heavy-duty vehicles, and motorcycles, as well as non-road engines across 9 different equipment categories, from hedge trimmers to snowmobiles. Did y'all do that?
So there is not any sufficient data. That's why the administrator, excuse me, let me finish. That's why the administrator is prohibiting the use of E15 for those vehicles. Medium and heavy duty gasoline vehicles.
Y'all didn't do that. My time's about run out. And obviously, you didn't do that. Your EPA staff made those recommendations. You just neglected even the EPA staff's recommendations on this, which is intolerable as far as I'm concerned. I'm the chairman of the Investigations Oversight Committee, and we particularly have been interested in scientific integrity. Y'all are not doing that. You're not heeding the President's recommendations to use scientific integrity. And frankly, when I go to a gas station for my boat, for my chainsaws, for my weed whacker and those types of things, E10 is bad for those things, and E15 is going to be disastrous for all those things. This was a terrible decision that y'all made, and I hope that y'all will go and consider the scientific and use scientific integrity, because you have not done so in a rush to try to produce this waiver. Mr. Chairman, my time's up. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Doctor. Mr. Tonko.
Thank you. Before I ask my question, is it possible to get a 1-minute response or 30-second response from Ms. Hogler?
Your clock's running.
It is. Did you want to respond to? No, I just saw you had some response, and I was going to give you 30 seconds of my time.
The agency is not required by law to do testing to make the case for off-road equipment. The agency had sufficient information, scientific information, to be concerned about off-road equipment, to be concerned about medium and heavy-duty gasoline engines, and to be concerned about motorcycles. That's why the agency is prohibiting the use of E15 in the marketplace. So we use the right science in a very robust scientific process to make these decisions.
Thank you. Several of you have mentioned in your written testimony that you believe the federal government should be supporting renewable fuel research, perhaps specifically to Mr. Burke and Ms. White. What kind of research would you recommend the federal government to fund to overcome the blend wall issue? Mr. Burke?
2 main areas. The first, self-evident, research in every technology that will, in coming decades, yield every possible liquid fuel from every possible source, either land-based or those such as algae, municipal waste, and whatever. Second, more subtle, more challenging, but historically necessary, as to some degree our content today reveals. Fund research at the juncture of overlapping sectors and overlapping technologies. We have a juncture in liquid transportation fuels with not only the existing petroleum industry, but with, as we've heard today, equipment, resources, other technology. Historically and inevitably, new technologies butt up against what is already at hand. And to some degree, we are remiss both in our success and in our responsibilities if we don't fund research at the point of juncture.
Ms. White, please.
Yes, thank you, Representative. We think it's really important to invest in drop-in biofuels that do not require any, that can use the existing infrastructure, do not require special pumps, et cetera. We also think it's important to take a lesson from corn ethanol. We don't want to repeat the mistakes that we saw. There needs to be a precautionary principle with respect to advanced biofuels. We'd like to see more research into switchgrass, into miscanthus, as well as into algae. But we really think that we need to constantly reassess the amount of money that we're putting into the advanced biofuels to make sure we get where we want to go.
Thank you. And Mr. Burke, North Carolina and my home state of New York have a lot in common as it relates to biomass resources. We're both large agricultural states, and we both have substantial forest resources. Do you have any recommendations for New York on how to drive economic development through sustainable feedstock production?
Yes, sir. If we in North Carolina and New York and beyond will successfully gain our expected new biofuels in coming years, the drawdown, the use of our natural resources will be extraordinary, unprecedented, and greater than we can probably even begin to anticipate. As such, we must merge technology, economic thinking, and environmental responsibility to begin to effectively determine not just what we can quickly harvest or grow, but what, equally important, we can sustainably grow and keep on the ground well into the future. It is possible that we will not need to only be attentive to sustainability and environmental implications. We will very possibly need in coming years to use biotechnology to purposefully alter various of our crop and forest resources so that they grow under the best conditions with the best outcome with minimal environmental degradation.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. I now recognize the chairman of the committee, Mr. Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mrs. O'Gay, I think the chairman started out the questions here making some inquiry. You rely on partial waiver decisions under Section 211F of the Clean Air Act in regard to mid-level ethanol blends in gasoline. And I think you know that the auto industry, along with the engine manufacturers and the oil industry, expressed a lot of concern about EPA's permitting up to 15% ethanol in gasoline, and that it may have a negative consequence. I think the chairman clearly pointed that out to you on engine performance emissions, and also create a situation where misfueling by consumers might occur. You understand that, don't you? Then let me ask you this. It's my understanding that EPA is proceeding, though, with the rulemaking on Tier 3. I don't think anybody's asked you about Tier 3, have they, today?
No.
And you know what I'm talking about, don't you?
Yes, I do.
This would impact the sulfur content in gasoline as well as the Reid vapor pressure of gasoline. What on earth is the justification for proceeding with the rulemaking at this time?
The Tier 3 rule that you're referring to, sir, is a regulation that has two drivers. One is the existing ozone NACs for both ozone and PM NACs. And the second is actually the Energy Independent Security Act that require EPA to evaluate the potential impacts of 36 billion gallons of renewable fuel in the marketplace. And if we determine that there are increases in emissions from the use of the 36 billion gallons, to take steps to reduce those increases. The agency is in the process of developing such a rule, but I'm not allowed at this point to give you any details because no decisions have been made. We're in the process of talking to the car companies, talking to the oil industry, and we're in the process of developing this regulation.
Well, as you know, Section 209 of the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007 required EPA to complete a study 18 months after enactment to determine whether, quote, the renewable fuel volumes required by the RFS2 will adversely impact air quality before proceeding with any rulemaking. The statute even further provides that you might determine additional rulemaking is not even necessary. Yet in September of last year, Assistant Administrator for Air and Radiation, Regina McCarthy, told Congress EPA was carrying out some of the long lead time work needed to perform the anti-backsliding analysis required by Section 209 and noted that EPA would incorporate the results of our analysis under the Section 209 assessment in the proposal on new vehicle and fuel control measures. So in other words, EPA failed to complete the Section 209 study by the statutory deadline, did you not?
The study, as Ms. McCarthy said, will be part of the Tier 3 proposal. Also, I may note that when we finalized the RFS2 program a couple of years ago, we did put a preliminary analysis of the potential impacts.
Well, did
of
you or did you not?
36
Excuse me. Did you or did you not fail to complete the Section 209 study by the statutory
We
deadline?
have not
Just tell me
completed.
yes or no.
Yes, sir.
All right. And as the study is not yet completed, when do you expect to complete the Section 209 study?
At the end of this year.
And do you expect to provide an opportunity for comment on the results of the study prior to the incorporation of the results into a proposal on new vehicle and fuel control measures?
That will be part of the proposal that will go out for the purpose of comments.
We'll be really further studying that, and we'll study the record that you're making here and that others from the EPA have made before this committee. I might caution you to understand that this subcommittee expects a full explanation of why this statutory deadline has been ignored and why it seems EPA is moving forward with control measures prior to completion of even a single study mandated by Congress. You know what that means, don't you, when they're mandated by Congress? Why can you just disobey that and ignore it?
Sir, we have not ignored it. We are late in completing the study, and we are going to do that by the end of the year.
Well, my time's running out, but I think it's only fair to let you know that you may be back before us again. It seems that there's a pattern of regulating in this area before the necessary and appropriate scientific analysis and testing is performed and reviewed. I think perhaps you're going to hear from Mr. Sensenbrenner and from Dr. Brown in the future. I thank you, and I yield back my time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bartlett.
Thank you. Mr. Burke, I noted your observations about we were going to need all of the alternative liquid fuels that we could get. I'm sure you're aware of the IEA reports of 08 and 2010 indicating that for the last 5 years the world has been stuck at 84 million barrels of oil a day, and their projections for the future are that production from our current fields are going to decrease quite dramatically. You know, if you are wildly optimistic about all of the alternative liquid fuels and add them up, they can't even come close to 84 million barrels a day. So thank you very much for your recognition of the challenges that we face there. Ms. Oge, I want to make the point that if you were really interested in the environment, you would certainly not have given a waiver for E15. You would have recommended that we not even have E10, because I don't think there is any justification from an environmental perspective for having E10. You are familiar, I'm sure, with the National Academy of Science report that said that at the year of their report, if we had taken all of their corn and converted it into ethanol, that it would have displaced just 2.4% of our gasoline. They noted, I think quite correctly, that we could have saved as much gasoline by tuning up our car and putting air in the tires as we would have saved by converting all of our corn to corn ethanol. You're familiar with that study?
Yes, I am.
Okay. You're also familiar with the studies that have indicated that the energy that goes into producing ethanol may be very close to the energy that we get out of ethanol. When you look at all of the inputs, for instance, about half the energy used to produce corn comes from natural gas from which nitrogen fertilizer is made. So there may be little or no increased energy available as a result of using ethanol, which means that there may be no diminution in the CO2 footprint. You're familiar with those studies?
I'm familiar with the studies that we have done as part of the RFS and the ones that Congress requires us to do on life cycle analysis.
Yeah, but there have been studies which have indicated that there is really, it may actually be negative. It may take more energy to produce it than not. But even if it's mildly positive, what happened when we produced all of that corn for ethanol? We planted where we shouldn't have planted. We took fields out of reserve. We put them in cultivation. There have been increased erosion. Today, for every bushel of corn that we grow in Iowa, 3 bushels of topsoil go down the Mississippi River. So even with our really good cultural practices, really good compared with yesteryear, it is still not sustainable. You can't have 3 bushels of corn get on the Mississippi River for 3 bushels of topsoil for every bushel of corn. But the next thing that happened was that we diverted acres from wheat to corn. Corn is a huge hog when it comes to using energy, is it not? And so now there was less wheat available, and we had a drought, and so now in the places where they produce rice, so less rice was available. So there was an increase in the basic foods for everybody in the world. Part of that laid at our doorstep because of this, what from my perspective, silly corn ethanol program. If you were really interested in the environment, why wouldn't you recommend that we do away with E10?
Sir, I work for EPA for 32 years. I'm a public servant. I'm not a political appointee. And I pride myself that every day I wake up, I make a difference. I don't make the laws. Congress does. We have a law in
But when we're doing something dumb, don't you feel some obligation to tell us we're doing something dumb and our support of ethanol is something dumb?
The Congress passed a law. The President signed it. We're implementing the law. As public servant, that's all we can do. And we have to use the best science and legal justification for the decisions we're making. And again, I feel pretty strong that the administrator made the best scientific basis for this waiver decision. But I will not comment about policies on ethanol.
But I thought that you were there to protect the environment. And I don't think the use of corn ethanol protects the environment. Would you argue with me that it does protect the environment?
Sir, I'm at EPA to implement the laws that Congress passed. Congress passed a law in 2007, and we are implementing it as Congress has required, based on the best science and legal criteria available to us.
So you're doing as little harm as possible to implement the laws that we shouldn't have passed. Is that what you're saying?
I'm not going to comment on that.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bartlett. Mr. Sensenbrenner, the Vice Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. To begin with, I'd like to submit for the record a letter which I sent to Administrator Jackson dated yesterday with all of the letters that I have received from both large engine and small engine manufacturers.
Without objection.
Now, Ms. Oge, I think we've seen pretty adequate testimony that E15 will reduce fuel efficiency, while at the same time Congress has mandated an increase in fuel efficiency. Isn't the EPA kind of working at cross purposes by having E15 at the same time there's been a congressional mandate? Remember, I have only 5 minutes, too.
Sir, you're right. Let's also...
Okay, I'm right. Fine, thanks.
No, I didn't say that.
Okay, now let's go on. Okay, we've heard from both Ms. White and the letters that I've received that E15 will void the warranty on most car engines and will wreck practically all of the smaller engines. And yet at the same time, there is no mandate from the EPA that gas stations continue to provide E10. Now, if you have a small engine for Dr. Brown's boat or Dr. Harris's lawnmower, or Mr. Palazzo's snowmobile in Mississippi, where are they going to find a fuel that doesn't wreck their engines if there is not a mandate that E10 be available?
Sir, we are not mandating E15 to be used. And E15 right now cannot be used until we register the fuel, so it's not a legal fuel. And there are many steps that need to take place at the state, local, and federal government for E15 to be marketed. When it does get marketed, we will be more than willing to take a look and see what happens to E10, because we agree with you that E10 is needed for off-road equipment and older equipment.
Well, you know, that's nice, but, you know, I started driving around when the leaded fuel ban came, and there was more than a sticker on the gas pump. They actually made the fuel import or the fuel ducts narrower, so that with the leaded fuel you had a wide nozzle and an unleaded fuel you had a narrow nozzle. And still, according to the statistics, 20% of the vehicles were misfueled. Now, you know, how are you going to be able to do that without having gas stations go to the extent of having separate pumps for E15 and E10 and some kind of a barrier to prevent the E15 from being put into engines that can only run on E10?
Sir, unleaded fuel, as you well remember, was mandated. Excuse me.
Yeah, well, let's
unleaded,
you know, I gave the example,
okay,
you know, of the different size gas import nozzles between leaded fuel and unleaded fuel when that mandate came. Now, if you have E10 and E15 at the same gas station, are you going to have separate pumps for that, which is an expense of the gas station, or are you going to have some kind of blockage so that E15 is not put into an engine that will only run on E10?
May I answer?
Yes.
We are not mandating E15 to be used. We mandated unleaded fuel because new vehicles introduced in the marketplace with catalytic converters, they would destroy those catalysts.
You know, I understand that, but now we're talking about a fuel that can destroy a small engine and an engine in a car that has been made or manufactured since 2001. And I used the example of the mid-'70s, where 20% of the cars were misfueled, even with the barriers that were available. Now, you know, you better start thinking this through. You know, I remember your visit to Milwaukee 15 years ago when the reformulated gas mandate came in, and as a result of some of your answers, the riot squad was being assembled in the parking lot across the street. And then you promised a hearing in Madison, which you walked out of because you didn't like what the public had to say. We're elected officials. We have to listen to what the public has to say. And I guess I'm warning you that if you have a repeat of what happened back 15 years ago with reformulated gas, the public is a lot less tolerant, and you better start looking at what the public thinks. You know, this fuel doesn't help the environment. The fuel does have all the problems that have been stated, and the EP ought to wake up and recognize that fact rather than being off in la-la land trying to impose another mandate from on high. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice Chairman. You know, you're right. On the Eastern Shore of Maryland, they've started selling good old-fashioned gasoline, you know, so you can use it in your boats without any ethanol. The Chair recognizes Mr. Palazzo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to sit in on your subcommittee hearing. I think Congressman Sensenbrenner said it best on addressing the question about the damage it's going to cause anything E10 or above to chainsaws, lawnmowers, boats, snowmobiles. But for the record, I own a four-wheeler, not a snowmobile. So, you know, to me, in this day and age, family budgets are tight. Americans are more busier now than ever. You know, just distractions, hardships, things that just take their mind off of what's happening. And I think most of these hardships, distractions, and crises in American lives are basically generated by overregulation and by a lot of the actions of the former Congresses. So I'm definitely concerned about misfueling and things of that nature. But I think that was pretty much asked and answered, especially with Mr. Soho, his comment that over 500 million pieces of equipment could be damaged if they use E10 or greater, or possibly even E10. A lot of people seem to think that has a lot of damage on small engines. and I agree, and up to $200 trillion in replacement just for those pieces of equipment, and that's just money American people don't have right now, and things are tight, and I just don't think we should be pushing what it feels like is more of a mandate on them. But my question for Ms. Oge, it's centered around the infrastructure concerns. My understanding is that the Underwriters Laboratory has not certified any existing fuel pumps to handle E15. Additionally, Underwriters Laboratory, along with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, conducted extensive testing on the use of E15 in new and used fuel dispensing equipment like hoses, valves, pumps, and nozzles. The testing was completed in November 2010 and showed that more than 50% of used equipment, more than 30% of new equipment failed when used with E15. Were these major infrastructure concerns considered by the EPA?
Sir, I think I'm familiar with the study that you're referring to. There was a Department of Energy sponsored study. Again, the Clean Air Act under 211F, the administrator in looking at these waivers has to determine to what extent a new fuel or fuel additive will impact, cause, or contribute for emission controls of that vehicle to fail. EPA is not responsible for dispenser units. As you know, a lot of state and local governments have that responsibility. And as I mentioned earlier, before E15 becomes a commercially available fuel in the marketplace, first we have to register this fuel. Today, EPA has not received a full application from the renewable fuel producers on the health effects of ethanol, so it's not registered, therefore it's not legally allowed to enter the marketplace. The second issue has to do with underground storage tanks. EPA just put out a guidance. There are issues of potential compatibility of materials, the issue that you are raising with dispensing units, plus there are 30 or 35 states that have ASTM laws that require changes from E10 to E15. So what I'm trying to say is that there are a lot of steps that need to be taken that EPA is not responsible before E15 is marketed.
Is there some form of timeline before this may be registered? I mean, because everybody assumes it's barreling down the road. So is this 2 years, 3 years? And you also mentioned that the states and local governments are responsible for the infrastructure. I mean, they're broke too. So how are we going to ask them to pick up the costs, or who do you expect to pick up the costs at the end of the day?
So the first question about registration, we have received some data from the renewable fuel producers. We don't have the full record, and we don't have a formal application from them, so I cannot give you a time frame. As far as dispensing units, retail stations have to meet local and state government regulations on compatibility of dispensing units, and the same thing for underground storage tanks. So it will vary from station to station, from state and local government laws.
This is just open for everybody in case I know everybody's focused on Ms. Oge, and hopefully I'll have a few extra seconds and won't get gavelled out. Does America have an energy policy? Does anybody want to try to tackle that in 15 seconds or less? It's pretty simple. One, stop the government policies that drive up the cost of energy, because our economic and national security is dependent upon affordable and available energy. Second is expand domestic energy production. That's American energy. So open up the East Coast, the West Coast, the offshore, onshore, Alaska, the Gulf of Mexico, and drill. Three things will happen. We'll reduce our dependence on foreign oil. We'll drive down the cost of energy, and we'll create American jobs. And three, promote an all-the-above approach: oil, nuclear, coal, natural gas. Heck, I'm okay with wind, solar, and water, and anything else you can think of, as long as in biofuels as well, as long as it's not subsidized by the American taxpayer. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we adjourn, we're going to have one more 5 minutes for each side, and the minority's trying to round up a member for their 5 minutes, but I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes to start a truncated second round. First of all, I just want to make a comment that There were some questions about the appearance of DOE at the hearing. Now, we don't think that it's necessary to have DOE because this is specifically about EPA making the ruling using that information. It's not whether the DOE study was adequate or inadequate. It's basically whether it was done scientifically. It was whether EPA needed more information in order to make this instead of just depending on that study. Now, let me ask specifically, Mr. Wasil, I got a question for you because I do have a marine engine, and I will tell you there is great fear about putting any ethanol at all into those engines. So they literally, there are places now popping up that sell good old-fashioned 100% gasoline to put into, which is a little pain because, you know, your marinas don't have it. You got to get it from a gas station. It's a whole other mess. But anyway, I remember back in the 70s when we first talked about putting ethanol in, and I would rebuild a carburetor, they'd say, look, you can't use ethanol in it because it affects the gaskets. Is that one of the concerns, the effect of ethanol on gaskets in an engine?
Sure, absolutely. That's a good point. Many of the components, fuel system components on the engines themselves are susceptible to damage from ethanol.
And thank you very much, because I got to keep it short.
Okay.
Ms. Oge, did the EPA test gaskets? I mean, because gaskets, you see, they degrade over time. It could take 2 years, 3 years for that gasket to fail, and the failure of a gasket in a fuel system can be a catastrophic event. Not only for the environment because it leaks gasoline at that point, but obviously it leaks gasoline, I mean, around a hot engine. Did the EPA consider how long a period you would have to study a gasket in a fuel system or an emissions control system before you can say confidently increasing the ethanol concentration will not adversely affect that gasket performance?
The DOE study of the 19 models, they tested each one of these models, about 88 cars, 120,000 miles. Also, they took some of the engines and they broke them up.
But they tested over what period of time?
120,000 miles for
over what period of time?
6 months to a year.
Ms. Oge, you do realize that that there is a time dependency of the wearing away of a gasket with exposure to ethanol.
So there are test procedures. When a company certifies a car, there are test procedures that EPA determines for the car company to demonstrate that the vehicle would meet the environmental standards for its full useful life. So there's similar test procedures that car companies are using today in short period of time to determine and to demonstrate that their cars would last.
But Ms. Oge, they're testing for E10.
Sir,
you're testing for E15. My question's simple. Did you all insist on a scientific test that lasted as long as the life of a car would last?
Sir, we tested E0 and E15. We had one car that failed E0 and three cars that failed, I believe, E0 and 2 cars that failed E15. The same test protocols that were used for E0 for the 120,000 miles that car companies are using to demonstrate that the car would last for 120,000 miles.
I'm not worried about the entire
10 years.
car. I'm worried about a gasket failure.
Sir, I'm telling you that we use the same test procedures that the car company has to use when they certify that their gaskets and their emission control systems would last for 120,000 miles, 80 years or 120,000 miles. The same test procedures were used by the Department of Energy. And if you're interested to know more details, be glad to provide that information.
I would be very interested in knowing how you tested that gasket failure, because my understanding is that you tested catalyst, that it tested catalyst performance. Do you mean, I don't understand, I'm not sure exactly, does that mean what comes out of catalytic converter at the end?
You're right that we tested catalyst performance, but also there were a number of models that were chosen where the engine was broken down for both E0 and E15, and they take a look at, to what extent there are valves that are affected, hoses, the engine is affected, and we found similar impacts of E0 to E15 for those engines. And
well, I'm shocked at that because I know that ethanol does things to gaskets that gasoline doesn't.
So be glad to share the information.
I'm going to recognize Dr. Bartlett for my last 30 seconds.
We have a second round. I'll claim my own 5 minutes.
Well, Dr. Bartlett, we decided since there are no minority members and they were trying to round up one that we would have 5 minutes.
More time.
I'll give you 30 seconds, but the gavel is not going to be very active. So take advantage of it.
Thank you very much. I wouldn't want my disaffection with ethanol to be extrapolated into believing that I'm not a supporter of alternative fuels. Mr. Burke, I was led to believe from some of your observations that you may be one of the exceptions that I refer to when I tell audiences that the innocence and ignorance in our country on energy matters is astounding. And with a few exceptions, we have truly representative government. I think you may be one of those exceptions. I gather that you are familiar with the IEA.
I think I will thank you for that, Dr. Bartlett.
I meant so. I meant
yes,
so,
sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Okay. You're familiar with the IEA projections of future oil production?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Do you believe that we're going to be getting 2/3 of all the oil that we pump just about 15, 20 years from now from fields from which we're getting nothing now?
I believe that all of our best estimations, prognostications, and thinking are likely to be confounded in coming years by factors barely known to us about fuel usage worldwide and gaining usage worldwide. In the light of such mercurial unknown changes in the future, we in North Carolina have determined that it is simply smart policy to grant that we need as much as possible of every kind of liquid fuel. We don't disavow petroleum from any source. It seems to us that in fuels, as in other areas, dependency on a mono source is never a good idea. That's why we don't like monopolies. That's why we were fearful of a corn blight many years ago. Single source, not good. So we are simply determining that provident future mongering suggests we should have the capability for as many kinds of liquid fuels as possible.
I don't know how many of you are familiar with the corn blight that you're referring to. I imagine that's the male Texas sterile cytoplasm that we were used to sterilize the corn and hybrid corn so we wouldn't have to pull the tassels off. And it got a blight, and we were threatened with having no corn the following year. So they went to the islands where they could grow 2 corn crops in a year. So we had some corn seed at very high prices the next year. When was that, sir?
I believe in the mid-'70s.
Yeah. Well, that was a wake-up call when you get to a monoculture and you see, to produce hybrid corn, you go in and tear the male part of it off. And that was a lot of work, and sometimes you missed it. And when you missed it, that was a bad deal because then you didn't have hybrid corn. So what they would do is they developed this male Texas sterile cytoplasm, which made the male Texas things sterile. But they got a blight that affected only that. And that's the risk that we have in our world of moving to only milk from Holsteins, only eggs from Leghorn chickens, and so forth. And you go to a monoculture, you run the risk that they may have a collapse and you may be in a real catastrophe. And that was kind of a wake-up call. I appreciate your tolerance, sir. Thank you very much.
Very much, Dr. Bartlett. Always learn something from your questioning. I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we'll ask you to respond to those in writing. And the record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments from members. And again, I want to thank you for your patience. We ran late. The witnesses are excused. The hearing is adjourned.
Mr. Chair, can the witnesses also provide information? I'd like to correct a couple of erroneous comments of Ms.
Well, yeah, we will in response to your questions. Thank you.